Before Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, I mostly knew Homer's story through an episode of Arthur. Well, let's find out how Christopher Nolan compares to a cartoon for kids, and more, right after the intro music. You're listening to Second Cut. This is the podcast where we talk about topics in film theory, criticism, history, and sometimes just review a movie. I'm Jacob, and I'm the one who isn't moving or on vacation this week, like a couple other co-hosts I know. But yeah, just by myself, I decided to take the opportunity to make a podcast review of Nolan's The Odyssey. It finally came out last week, and it is one of this year's most anticipated films and a prestige adaptation of one of history's iconic stories. It's enormous. It brings the appropriate spectacle that such an epic deserves. But I think what makes it great for me is the central moral problem with the film. The Trojan horse won the war for the Greeks, but the immorality of disguising violence as a gift has repercussions for Odysseus and the land that he loves. I like this film a lot, and it's definitely my favorite I've seen in 2026 so far. I don't think it's going too far to say it competes with Nolan's best films due to its scale, the way it tells a classic myth for a new generation, and just how good it is, frankly. I should say up front, I have not read Homer's Odyssey, so this isn't going to be any kind of deep literary adaptation assessment or anything like that. Anything that I do know about it is from Googling. So yeah, this is pretty much about how Nolan's film works on its own, and I will be discussing full spoilers for the movie. The Odyssey is generally dated to around the 8th or 7th century BCE, and like the poem, the film follows the Greek king Odysseus as he tries to return home from the Trojan War. Stranded on an island with Charlize Theron, he begins to remember the horrors of his journey, while his wife and son contend with a group of guys trying to marry the queen. These stories have always been revised, expanded, and adapted by whoever is telling them, and Nolan's version is just another stage in that process. So, something that I'm not considering, again, because I haven't read it, is how accurate is it to whatever the definitive version is. That's not something I'm interested in. There's a pretty short list of directors I'd want tackling this film, but obviously Nolan was probably going to be on there. Odysseus resembles his other brilliant but tortured protagonists, especially Robert Oppenheimer. Odysseus solves a problem that wins a war, only to suffer when confronted with its moral consequences. The poem's structure is actually right in Nolan's wheelhouse, too. It's non-linear, it's divided between Odysseus and Telemachus, and it's filled with stories embedded within other stories. Nolan was apparently immediately impressed by how radical the structure of the poem was, and the little bit of reading I did about it caught me off guard, and I could totally see how he was drawn to it. Nolan was briefly attached to the project that became Troy, and according to the Los Angeles Times, he was drawn to the idea of the Trojan horse sinking into the sand, and that's one of the first images shown in the Odyssey. The opportunity to make this film finally came after Oppenheimer, an example of how financial success under the current industrial conditions gives a filmmaker the creative leeway to make a big-budget adaptation of a 2,700-year-old poem. I think the commercial success separates 2020's Nolan from other popular auteurs. I especially think Denis Villeneuve, pretty much anyone else that would be on the short list of this is the person I want making the Odyssey. But really Nolan is pretty much a franchise in his own right, and Universal is already seeing the dividends at the box office. First, I want to touch on the cinematography. The Odyssey marks Christopher Nolan's 5th collaboration with Hoyte van Hoytema, and it is consistent with the style of Nolan's other films. Even if we go back to the ones with Wally Pfister as the cinematographer, I think they stopped working together in 2012. So when the trailers and production stills first appeared, people complained about the lack of color. That's the big critique I remember, and the film does definitely feature a heavily desaturated palette, but I don't think desaturated is the same as colorless. There are bright ivories, rich blacks, dark blues, burning oranges, and a muted red that's swallowed by darkness in the third act. It's a really cool effect. Calypso's white island, white sand island is distinct from the black gravel of Hades and the orange and black furnace of a pillaged Troy. And by the end, Penelope is wearing a really rich red after the uncertainty surrounding her husband's absence is finally cleared. And also Tom Holland, he gets like a really bright gold crown and, white like toga outfit kind of thing. But the film might look more fun and lively with brighter colors, but I don't think it fits with the story being told. And it was always kind of a thoughtless critique for me to call the film visually dull before it even had the opportunity to establish its meaning. Color has greater cinematic purpose than just providing maximum saturation for neuron activation. We aren't watching a realist period piece, we're watching a grounded telling of a myth. Nolan and Van Hoytema's visual style shows us a world at the end of an era, exhausted by the Trojan War, that was not the heroic conflict that the songs made it out to be. IMAX is another major point in the marketing and online discussion, because the Odyssey is the first feature photographed entirely with IMAX cameras. Nolan and Van Hoytema shot both the enormous action scenes and the intimate dialogue scenes using massive cameras and the unusually large IMAX film negatives. That required that whole setup. It required specifically designed acoustic housing to reduce the camera noise, tightly organized procedures for changing the roughly 3-minute film magazines, and tricks like placing mirrors around the camera so actors could maintain their sightline when the equipment physically separated them on set. With IMAX, it's really the shape of the image that matters. So the full IMAX frame, it's 1.43 to 1, and that is much taller than conventional widescreen. Many digital IMAX theaters present the film at 1.9 to 1 rather than the full 1.43. And I think that height, it helps us feel the scale and importance of the story. Whether we're looking at the throne room, a cave, or the open sea, the setting is as monumental as the heroes and the story itself. One of my favorite examples is a match cut from Telemachus' ship as he's going to see Menelaus. It cuts over to Calypso's island, and that's where Odysseus is whenever we meet him really for the first time. And the son, Telemachus, his lone ship, it's sailing on the dark waves. That contrasts with the white sands where the father stands alone. The composition connects the two while also emphasizing their separation. It's a good shot. Good editing. Agamemnon is given the opposite treatment, so low angles turn the man in black armor into a hulking icon, manufacturing the image of a king who seems nearly as powerful as the gods. When we later meet him in Hades, the camera brings him down to eye level. The icon has been reduced to another dead man, even if he still refuses to remove the helmet. Having seen the film in both standard laser presentation and digital IMAX, I can vouch for both formats. My AMC screening presented at 1.85 to 1, while my digital IMAX used 1.9 to 1. And those ratios, they both preserve the tall composition, although the physical screen size and projection experience is obviously different. I also think that the sound for me in the IMAX version was just a little bit better than in the standard laser. So there are only 55 theaters, I think, worldwide that can show the full 1.43 to 1 image. There's 41 IMAX 70mm theaters, one near me that is just constantly full, and 14 IMAX GT laser theaters. So some of those are going to be film, and then 14 are going to be the laser. So the approved 2.39 to 1 presentation removes substantially more of the vertical image. So that's a version I would try to avoid personally. If IMAX is unavailable, try and find a 1.9 to 1 digital. Well, obviously, I do think the full IMAX is going to be unavailable for you. So look for the 1.9 to 1 digital IMAX or the standard 1.85 to 1. Those are by far the best formats to see this in, just to preserve the aspect ratio integrity as much as possible. I also want to address the idea of historical accuracy, so to speak. And by the way, but I'm not qualified to in any way. But it's a lazy critique to say of that critique, to say this is a movie involving gods, a Cyclops, and a sentient whirlpool. But like, also, I'm not caring too much about the accuracy of things in a, ultimately fantasy story. At most, the story may preserve some cultural memory of a war at Troy involving Greek kings, and beyond that, we're dealing with mythology, right? Somehow things like black armor, a certain helmet style or whatever, like that's where you're going to draw the line on like what is and isn't okay. In a timepiece on the director, Time magazine, Nolan discussed this element of the production design, and he pointed to some surviving daggers from that period with blackened metal surfaces. That's evidence that bronze can be made very dark, apparently. So Nolan and costume designer Ellen Miroyanik, something like that, I definitely butchered it, they extrapolated that possibility into Agamemnon's black armor. So the design combines like artistic licenses with something that is at least theoretically possible within the material culture of the period. But let's be honest, it's black because that's cool. Like, it doesn't matter that he looks like Batman. And, speaking of Batman, Agamemnon is being constructed as a symbol, right? His costume isn't intended to teach us, what did Greek kings wear back in the Bronze Age? No, it communicates who this particular version of Agamemnon is. He's arguably the human villain of this story. He represents the cruelty and arrogance of the Greeks as they destroy Troy, and the black armor transforms him into a faceless icon of military dominance. That is part of the film's larger production design strategy. It uses the familiar visual language of the historical epic and then kind of morally complicates those images, right? So Menelaus, he strokes Helen's famous face, right? The face that is said to have launched 1,000 ships, and then he turns it. And with that reveal, we see that she's been scarred. Penelope's loom, it represents her patience and her strategy. She has to deal with the suitors, but its threads also kind of resemble like, prison bars over her face. The Trojan horse is the defining object of the production design. It's usually remembered as a monument to ingenious strategy, but Nolan imagined it as like a desperate structure beached into sinking sand. Its design makes the legendary plan look unstable and possibly even impossible. I mentioned this in our Batman episode, but Nolan's objective is grounded verisimilitude. That doesn't mean pretending every detail has been archaeologically verified, and nobody asks or cares whether the Cyclops sequence was filmed inside the actual cave where Polyphemus, supposedly lived or whatever. We understand that movies are shaped by practical limitations and artistic intent. Historical research isn't worthless, but accuracy by itself is not artistic achievement, really. What would a supposedly more accurate costume for Agamemnon accomplish as he strides through the gates at Troy? What would it communicate that the black armor does not? Watching trailers with a CinemaSins checklist doesn't tell us whether filmmaking works, and the more useful question to ask always is, how does this choice serve the story? The star-studded ensemble knocks this film out of the park, and our familiarity with these actors also helps establish the characters instead of making them feel like a collection of big-name cameos, right? So, look, I'll start by saying I'm not the biggest Matt Damon fan, but he's really good as Odysseus. Odysseus doesn't need to be some kind of like Jack demigod played by someone like The Rock. Damon brings calm leadership and defiant persistence to the role, while disappearing beneath a succession of beards and hairstyles and costumes. He is charismatic when convincing his men to follow his latest plan, lost and broken when stranded on Calypso's island, and genuinely grief-stricken as he confronts what he did at Troy. He lacks the manufactured grandeur of Agamemnon, while remaining completely convincing as a peak human during the action scenes. Those who listen to our Anne Hathaway episode know that I've generally considered her only a fine actress, and seeing her in this powerful, sort of matriarchal role shows me that she may still have more to offer in the next phase of her career. She isn't playing an every woman like she did in The Devil Wears Prada or Bride Wars, and the understated quality. Her understated quality doesn't really work for me in Mother Mary. Here she has like a lot of power and authority, and it's a good role for her. She brings a lot of energy and power to Penelope, and there's a real edge to the character. She navigates her complicated feelings about Odysseus' absence, the impatience of the suitors, her relationship with her son, her desire to retain power after ruling Ithaca for 20 years. Hathaway's natural earnestness has hardened into a controlled, almost threatening composure, and it's really good. Hopefully this will be one of Tom Holland's final roles, playing such like an overtly boyish character. And it's the first of, hopefully, several collaborations with Nolan. I'd like to see that. His demeanor works well for Telemachus, who is very Peter Parker-like as he struggles to come into his own as the future king of Ithaca. He's not yet completed as a person, and his mentor, who I learned this week is the source of the term mentor, because that's his name, spars with him in a dynamic reminiscent of Timothée Chalamet and Jason Momoa in Dune, and the associations with Spider-Man and Paul Atreides are kind of difficult to escape, but they do fit the role at the same time. Robert Pattinson's Antinous is probably the most immediately entertaining part of the film. He's the primary suitor, and he's also a draft dodger who tricked a boy into going to Troy in his place. He's cruel to anyone he considers beneath him. He presents himself to Penelope as though he was thoughtful and caring, and he reveals his cowardice in the heat of battle. Pattinson makes every side of that performance feel like the same calculating personality, and if I had to choose like one person to be Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars, I would definitely pick him. Jon Bernthal's real-life, self-styled warrior charisma makes him a natural fit for Menelaus, who recounts the triumphant version of the Trojan horse story, and Elliot Page is also really good in the small but crucial role of Sinon, the boy Antinous sent to Troy in his place, but it is a little funny watching like a nearly 40-year-old man play a teenager. Something largely absent from the complaints about Lupita Nyong'o's casting, and by the way, she's barely in the film as Helen, so like, all of that outrage is completely unjustified. Obviously, it is in the first place. It wasn't based on time on screen. It was based on race stuff. But she also plays Helen's sister, Clytemnestra. And Clytemnestra gets the way more interesting role, really. She's the wife of Agamemnon, who, we learned sacrificed their daughter before he went off to war. And what happens is he comes back home and she kills him. And like that's a really interesting, like, it's told so briefly in the film, but it's a really interesting dynamic. And it kind of is a bummer for Clytemnestra that so much like historical focus is put onto her sister. Obviously, it's also really stupid to care about who the race of somebody in a ultimately fantasy film is, or any film really. The American accents and modern expressions, like they don't bother me. Like I saw people complaining that Tom Holland calls him dad. That's dumb. Having the cast speak naturally is preferable to making Matt Damon attempt a vaguely British accent or Shakespearean dialogue, neither of which would be any more authentically Greek, Audibility, that's already a persistent criticism of Nolan, so plain language fits a Nolan film really well, in my opinion. Objections to the accents are ultimately a matter of taste. The approach feels cohesive, but there's also the possibility that the film has something to say about, like, I don't know, some sort of affiliated group of states who don't respect the sovereignty of others in the modern age. I don't know. By the way, I skipped over this. Samantha Morton's Circe it's broader and like, I don't know, a little more theatrical, but she is essential in like articulating the film's ideas about war and how humans ought to treat one another. So it's a great scene. Wouldn't mind seeing what the other options were as far as performer. When the dialogue recedes, the Odyssey is often at its best. Christopher Nolan has always favored impressionistic sound, and the sound design combines with Ludwig Göransson's score to create my favorite aural experience in any Nolan film. At its strongest, the line between sound design and music dissolves. Music emerges from water, wind, animals, weapons, and bodies, and the score often prioritizes tone and atmosphere, but melody emerges when the moment calls for it, flowing through the film as a nearly continuous ambient presence. By the way, I really like Göransson's score for The Mandalorian this year. That was probably my favorite part of that movie. But Nolan asked Göransson to avoid a conventional orchestra. Instead, the score combined synthesizers, voices, 35 bronze gongs, and a specially constructed oversized lyre. The plucking of that lyre is connected to the sound of Odysseus' bow, bringing violence, music, and storytelling all together. The Sirens are the best demonstration of this approach. Nolan does not play an irresistibly beautiful song and ask whether it be convincing enough to lure anybody overboard. The sequence places us within the sailors, whose ears are being filled with wax. As each ear is sealed, the mix closes around it. The higher frequencies disappear, and we are left with something resembling a low-pass filtered mixture of bass, vibration, and muffled physical sound. One sailor removes his wax and immediately jumps overboard to swim to the island. Separately, we're given brief exposure to Odysseus' screams as he listens while restrained, tied to the mast. Both indicate the song's overwhelming power, even though the song itself remains withheld from us. The melancholy melody that plays instead paints the psychological mood of the sequence. Intercut with the scene is Odysseus describing the experience of the crew afterward, and he tells them the Sirens offered what he most wants and can no longer recover: Penelope, Telemachus, Ithaca, and the person he was before Troy. More dangerously, the Sirens suggest that he may not truly want to go home, that his endless mission allows him to avoid confronting the promises that he's broken and the damage that he has done. The melody returns during the destruction of Troy, associating that sound with the moment that Odysseus lost his former self. The audio also allows Nolan to include the gods without constantly cutting to actors sitting around Mount Olympus, as we saw in the much sillier representation from Jason and the Argonauts. Nolan considered showing the gods physically throwing thunderbolts, but immersing us in the storms and turbulent seas better expresses how these characters perceive divine power. Zeus enters through thunder and lightning, while Poseidon is the sea becoming hostile. Athena physically appears to Odysseus in the figure of Zendaya, but the soundscape best accomplishes Nolan's representation of the gods. When thunder punctuates Antinous' death, it can function as dramatic weather, Zeus's judgment, and Odysseus interpreting his own violence as justice all at the same time. The spectacle operates according to the same principle. The value of practical effects is not simply that something was, done for real. It's that the actors must contend with actual weight, movement, balance, and the interaction affects their performance and our perception of that performance. Odysseus' ship was genuinely seaworthy and traveled with the production, while the Cyclops combined a physical performance foundation guided by Bill Irwin with extensive effects work. The Cyclops sequence is really cool. It uses horror to reinforce the perspective of Odysseus and his men, but the physicality of the performance also creates unexpected empathy for the monster. Men are eaten by the handful to horrifying, shrill music. That same sound later amplifies the cries of the blinded creature. Circe's sequence finds a different version of the same idea. The men's transformations are grotesquely physical, while the pigs pounding against the door and the calls of the crow gradually become percussion, building the scene's tension. The environment's not merely accompanied by the score, it appears to be creating it, and it is its own type of spectacle, even though it isn't the same as like the in-fight scene with the suitors or any of the other big action moments. And I think the IMAX definitely has a lot to do with that. The Trojan horse remains the film's defining spectacle. During its first account, the Greeks survive inside a sinking structure, covered in waste and surrounded by dead comrades. They emerge into Athena's temple and hold the gates against overwhelming numbers. It's nasty and claustrophobic and thrilling. And when the film finally returns to Troy, bass, fire, and screams and a roving third-person camera, which makes me think of like Emmanuel Lubezki's kind of third-person perspective tracking shot. It transforms that same physical event into sensory trauma. The shift from tightly controlled action to overwhelming assault is one of the film's strongest demonstrations of how sound, framing, and narrative perspective can completely change our experience of an event. At its core, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is about what happens when leaders violate trust within a fragile social order. The Trojan horse weaponizes trust by turning an apparent gift into an ambush, and Odysseus spins his journey encountering a world where hospitality, leadership, family, and storytelling have all been contaminated by the destruction of Troy. Zeus's law is frequently spoke about in the film, and in this world, travelers depend upon strangers for food, water, shelter, and hosts and guests must trust that they will not be harmed by the other. And that's really the driving force of the plot, is the Odysseus and his men trying to get food and supplies and stuff as they're on their way home. Circe shows that it's not really just good manners, right? It's for someone potentially alone and at the mercy of armed invaders. Hospitality is a necessity. It's got to be a two-way thing. That's why Nolan tells the horse story repeatedly. The Trojans experience it as like a thing that they found and are convinced to trust by Elliot Page's Sinon. Menelaus remembers it as an extraordinary feat of endurance and military skill, and Odysseus eventually remembers the people who suffered once the plan succeeded. Menelaus' version isn't entirely false, and I think that makes the structure way more interesting than just like some brief flashbacks later or only one version of the story. You know, the men inside the horse, they were brave and the plan was really smart, but they used that courage and that brilliant plan to, you know, do horrible things. The film therefore implicates its own spectacle, and it demonstrates how storytelling, and in this case, visual storytelling, can convert the same violence into either heroism or atrocity. The heroic song does not necessarily invent what happened. It decides which part of what happened that people will remember. That's the histories remembered by the victors thing, right? And that raises the same question frequently applied to DC movies or Transformers movies. What consequences are being ignored because the violence on screen has been framed as heroic entertainment? The Odyssey doesn't avoid that criticism. It incorporates the criticism into its own visual construction of the myth. That deconstruction is part of what elevates Nolan's blockbuster above much of the industry spectacle. It helps explain his particular appeal to critics and cinephiles as well. Odysseus is particularly dangerous because he persuades other people to inhabit his version of reality. He constructs a story that Sinon performs, the Trojans accept, and his crew has to live with. His greatest weapon is narrative control, and his guilt comes from recognizing that his story had consequences that he did not expect. The voyage is structured around that realization. Each encounter tests whether people can enter another person's space without becoming predator or prey. The Cyclops eats the people who enter his home, and Odysseus can't resist inflicting further punishment once his escape becomes possible. At Circe's home, he carries a concealed dagger because he assumes hospitality is going to be another trap, and in a way he's right. The crew understands they can't eat the cattle, but the alternative is starvation. So they knowingly violate the boundary because, as they say, choosing drowning is better than dying slowly on land. By the time Odysseus reaches Ithaca, the suitors have become the domestic culmination of everything released at Troy. They entered as guests and gradually began behaving as owners. They consumed the household's resources, intimidate Penelope, and plan to murder Telemachus. They are Trojan horses in human form, people admitted under one social identity who conceal a campaign of conquest inside of it. Odysseus cannot answer them simply by becoming the old conquering king again. He returns to his own palace as a beggar. Taking on Sinon's identity, it puts Odysseus in the frame of mind as someone he manipulated, someone who died because he was willing to win at any cost. And his most important act isn't escaping the Cyclops or surviving the Sirens or stringing the bow. It's confessing to Penelope and Athena. With Penelope and Athena, Odysseus finally relinquishes his narrative control. He tells a story of Troy that destroys his own heroic image, allowing them to judge him and beginning to make amends for the promises he broke. Athena's presence during the confession is important because of the attempt to reckon with the desecration of her temple and priestesses that he enabled at Troy. It's the battle with the suitors that finally tests whether Odysseus has actually learned anything. The sequence deliberately parallels the Trojan horse, as Odysseus disguises himself, prepares a trap. The palace doors are locked and the suitors have been prevented from accessing their weapons. He hasn't stopped being a strategist, but it's about what the strategy is for and where his violence stops. Antinous is singled out as the ringleader of the household's corruption. And after, cutting down a ton of them in sort of a Kill Bill style sequence, many of them begin to kneel, and he spares them. So while the climax is extremely exhilarating, it's that restraint that creates the moral distinction for Odysseus. He stops when the other men surrender and submits to the consequence of the violence he considered to be necessary by leaving Ithaca for exile. Maybe people can't really be forgiven, restored, or fully redeemed, but we can be rehabilitated by submitting to moral law, showing mercy, trusting others, and trying to do better going forward. Odysseus cannot unburn Troy, recover the men he lost, or repair every bond that he broke, but he can tell the truth and accept responsibility for what he has done. The more I think about the Odyssey, the better it gets. It's definitely a 10 out of 10 for me, and again, maybe Christopher Nolan's best film. It is also a 3-hour movie that left me wanting more, and if we ever do get a longer version, all right, Nolan, I'm going to need an intermission, okay? That's my only suggestion. Thank you for joining me on this solo episode of Second Cut. We'll be back next week with something else and another co-host or two. Until then, you can find Sam at SSP Thinks Film, and his review of the Odyssey is up on our Substack. Kieran doesn't want to be found, but if you must, he's K-Judgmental. You can find me at Jacob Film Guy, and you can find us all at Second Cut Pod or email us at secondcutpod@gmail.com. That's it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.